Say decide. He was thinking about whether he should run for president for a third term. He was still thinking about it. And many Americans thought he could be president for life if he wished. Who controls the voting here this time in history? The common man. He probably could have run as many times as he wanted and be elected. However, Jackson, you've got to remember he wasn't in great health when he took the presidency in the first place. Too many duels, too many war wounds, too many fights, whatever he was involved in. Well, his little body had had enough, and he decided it was time to retire, and he announced he would not seek a third term. Wouldn't seek a third term. Who's he going to push his support behind? Martin Van Buren, very good, because that's his vice president. So the Democrats then are going to nominate Vice President Van Buren for the presidency with Richard M. Johnson as his running mate. So Jackson throws his support behind Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren will be the Democratic nominee for president in 1836, and he will choose Richard M. Johnson to be his running mate. Now, the Republican Party's taken a rear-end kicking or two lately, and so they are in disarray. So a new political party comes into the mix, the Whig Party. So the Republicans are kind of in disarray now, similar to the way the Federalists were. And all of a sudden now the Whig Party enters the election. And they don't think they have a very good chance to win. So they come up with a little bit of a strategy. We'll see if it works. So they don't think they can win outright against Van Buren. Too many common people, right? And Van Buren's going to support Jackson's policies. So they don't choose one presidential candidate, they choose three. All three from different parts of the country. So they don't just choose one to run, they choose three. They choose Daniel Webster. They choose Daniel Webster as one of their candidates. They choose William Henry Harrison. And they choose Hugh L. White. So the Whigs have a new strategy. They're not going to pick one, they're going to pick three. Daniel Webster, William Henry Harrison, and Hugh L. White. This strategy became known in history as the favorite son policy, because they have nominated three favorite sons, three Whigs they're confident in. So this strategy of nominating more than one candidate for the presidency in 1836 by the Whigs becomes known in history as the favorite son policy. What's their strategy? Let's see if anybody's got their thinking cap on. What's the strategy here, Gabe?
If they take enough of the popular votes, they might get it to move to the House.
You're close. You just made one small error. You're right. They thought if they can split the electoral vote, you were right pretty much, that then it would go to the House. And they thought they had enough support in the House that they could win the presidency with one of their three candidates. So their strategy wasn't to win the election outright. They hoped to divide the number of electoral votes, what happened in 1824, and throw it to the House. If no one could get the number they needed, it would go to the House. So that was their strategy. The Whigs had hoped to divide the number of electoral votes, as was the case during the election of 1824, and with no candidate getting the majority of electoral votes needed, the election would be sent to the House, and they thought they had support in the House to win this election. Not a bad move, really, when you think about it. Well, unfortunately, it didn't work. Van Buren needed 170 electoral votes to capture the presidency. He didn't need that many, he needed less than that, but he won 170 electoral votes to capture the presidency. William Henry Harrison was the closest competition. He won 73 votes. But the Whig strategy fails in 1836. Van Buren gets 170, more than he needs. Closest competitor, William Henry Harrison, was 73. So on March 4th of 1837, Martin Van Buren gave his inaugural address and was sworn in as the nation's 8th president. On March 4th of 1837, Martin Van Buren gave his inaugural address and was sworn in as the 8th president of the United States. During his inaugural address, he made it clear that he would follow in the footsteps of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson. During his inaugural address, the new president stated that he would follow in the footsteps of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson. Anybody heard much about Martin Van Buren other than he was a president? That's what happens sometimes, because he was barely in office when the nation plunged into an economic depression. So he was barely in office and the nation plunged into an economic depression. And during his 4 years as president, Van Buren and his administration did not think the government could or should do anything to try to stop the depression. So he just sat back and waited for the depression to run its course, just like a bad cold. So a person gets a bad cold, you're thinking to yourself, geez, I really don't want to go to the doctor and take that effort to go to the doctor, spend that money. I'll just let the cold run its course. It might take some time, but sooner or later I'll get well. Well, that's what Martin Van Buren's philosophy was of this depression. I don't want to put that much effort out. I don't want to try to get myself in trouble. We'll just let it run its course and it'll come out of it. Which it did, but what did it do to him? Kept him from ever winning another election, right? So that'll move us to the election of 1840. Election of 1840. Well, as I mentioned, because President Van Buren chose to sit back and wait for the Depression to run its course, he wasn't going to be a factor in the election of 1840. He actually was nominated for re-election by the Democratic Party, though. Even though he didn't really figure in this depression is going to seal his political fate. So the Democrats were foolish enough to go ahead and nominate him for re-election. But he had done nothing to help the depression. Well, the Whig Party's back in action, and they're going to nominate the guy that had the most success against Van Buren last time, which was who? William Henry Harrison. So William Henry Harrison is going to be the presidential nominee, and he is going to choose John Tyler for vice president. John Tyler. I'll just tell you a little history story. You can write this part down if you want. William Henry Harrison was a general during the war, and he actually fought the Indians on the banks of the Tippecanoe River during the battles with the Indians. And so the Whig campaign slogan in this election was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Pretty snazzy. Tippecanoe referring to the battle of the Tippecanoe River that William Henry Harrison fought against the Indians, and Tyler, his vice president. Kind of catchy. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Well, the Whigs, what's the only thing they campaigned on? What's the only thing the Whigs campaigned on? No, I mean, what did they, when you campaign against somebody or campaign for yourself, what's the whole thing they concentrate on? Yeah, the Depression, how bad Martin Van Buren handled the Depression. That's all they had to campaign on. This guy stunk it up, man. He didn't do anything for the Depression. He just sat back and let it run its course. Van Buren gets 60 electoral votes in this election. 60. William Henry Harrison gets 234. That's a pretty big butt kicking when you unseat an incumbent president. It normally doesn't happen. So, William Henry Harrison wins the election, 234 electoral votes to 60 for Van Buren, and becomes the nation's 9th president. Okay, that'll take us to the final days of President Andrew Jackson. Final days. I got something new. I saved on my favorites, a currency calculator. Okay, that'll go with my first statement. When Andrew Jackson left the presidency in March of 1837, no, because he went the next year, he was 70 years old, and he was more than $7,000 in debt, which is $195,000 in today's dollars, to give you an idea. Okay? So he was $7,000 in debt at the age of 70, about $190,000. Why was he so in debt? Anybody think about what we talked about in his life? Why would he be in debt to $7,000? Where would he lose money?
Was it horse race?
Well, not so much horse racing, but you're close. What was his bid on his plantation? Okay? It was very poorly managed. While he served as president, his adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., poorly managed his plantation in Tennessee. And so he became $7,000 in debt, or about $195,000 in today's dollars. He was in debt because of poor management by his adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr. He also was in a state of depression over William Henry Harrison's victory in the election of 1840. Because when we say the end of the Jacksonian era, the Whigs are going to represent everything Jackson despised. He knew that he had lost control. The Jacksonian era, the Democratic Party, had lost control of the country. That very much depressed him. He was very, very disappointed in William Henry Harrison's victory in the election of 1840 because he knew the Jacksonian era, or Jacksonian democracy, was coming to an end. And again, he knew that the Whig Party stood for everything opposite he had established during his presidency. Well, on June 8th of 1845, June 8th of 1845, Jackson died at his home at the Hermitage in Nashville, surrounded by family and friends. On June 8th, 1845, Jackson died at his home with family and friends. You know who was at his side at the time of his death? Hannah. Who was Hannah? You really would have to listen. If you were paying attention to the last video, you might get this. Who was Hannah? She was at his side. Who was Hannah? Close. What? Close.
Wasn't it his slave?
It was his slave. And where else was Hannah at a tragic time? Who else? When his wife died. That's exactly right. So also at his side at the time of his death was his slave Hannah, whom his wife had died in her arms. Remember that in the movie? When he said, "Mr. Jackson, Mr. Jackson." When she said that, and he came in and found his wife died of a heart attack, Hannah was the same person there when Rachel died as well. Well, President Andrew Jackson was buried next to Rachel at the couple's Tennessee plantation known as the Hermitage. Okay, we'll go to our last subtopic, finish this thing up, and that would be the inauguration of William Henry Harrison. Anybody know anything about this guy? Really?
He was from the Whig Party.
Okay. Well, we'll tell you then. I thought somebody might know. William Henry Harrison was inaugurated on March 4th, 1841. March 4th, 1841. And it was a very unfavorable day concerning weather. It was a very cold, windy, brisk day. And it started to rain pretty hard. It wasn't a very nice day in Washington, D.C. on March 4th, 1841. It was cold, windy, brisk, rainy. And William Henry Harrison was 68 years old when he was inaugurated as President of the United States. He was 68, which might be considered a little bit older for a president. And even though the weather was horrid, he insisted on delivering his inaugural address, even though the weather was terrible. Drenching rain coming down at the end of his speech, which lasted an hour and 40 minutes. That's a pretty long inaugural speech. So even though the weather was terrible and began to rain, he insisted on continuing his speech, and he stood in the rain, drenching at the end, and spoke for an hour and 40 minutes. Arrived at the White House, which is traditional when you give your inauguration speech at the Capitol, then they take you to the White House, move into your new home. And when he moved into the White House, he was soaked, and he came down with a cold, which grew progressively worse. So Harrison arrives at the White House after his inaugural address, came down with a cold, which grew progressively worse. On April 4th, 1841, exactly a month later, President Harrison died of pneumonia. He was only in office 1 month. And he died of pneumonia from the cold that he caught giving his inaugural address a month earlier. So as a result, on April 4th, 1841, just a month after giving his inaugural address, he dies of pneumonia. So John Tyler becomes the first vice president in American history to succeed to the presidency. John Tyler becomes the first vice president in American history to succeed to the presidency. And again, another tidbit, during the time that Tyler finished Harrison's term, there was no vice president. We went that entire presidency of John Tyler when he succeeded William Henry Harrison without a vice president. Now, I'm going to tell you two things that occurred during the administration of John Tyler. And we're going to cover them in our quick finish up the semester. One is something called westward expansion occurred, in which the boundaries of the nation were extended to the Pacific Ocean. Okay? The boundaries of the nation were extended to the Pacific Ocean. And probably the more important thing that happened during the administration of John Tyler is you started having differences of opinion between the North and South, which are going to be the starting infection for something we're going to know as the Civil War. But what's the first issue going to be where we're going to have an issue? It's not going to be in the Civil War. We're going to have an issue of Texas. And Texas belongs to who at this time?
Mexico.
Mexico. And Mexico is allowing people from the United States to live in Texas until too many get there and they get a little bit too big for their britches and want independence from Mexico. And that's going to lead to what we know as the Mexican War. These are things that are going to occur during this administration of John Tyler. So here's kind of what the plan is. That's the end of the lecture. So here's what we're going to be doing. Tomorrow, we are going to watch a third video on Andrew Jackson, which is his presidency. Then I'm going to give you a review, and then we are going to have a test or quiz on Thursday. Okay? Friday is a shot day because of the wrestling. Monday, I'm going to show you that video I talked about that Fox News came up with on Andrew Jackson. And then we will spend Tuesday and Thursday during the semester exam completing the material on westward expansion and the Mexican War. I will give you my notes. You will not need to take any. You will simply put those in your binder and we will cover that. Yes? Tuesday. Where are you going? It's a bad day to miss before semester. You better reconsider that. You can't choose. All right, before you put your notebook away, I want you to put this in there. The Supreme Court decision concerning the Cherokee Indians and the state of Georgia over whether they could take their lands or not that they were ruled in favor of was called Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. That was the Supreme Court decision in which John Marshall stated that the state of Georgia had absolutely no jurisdiction to take Cherokee land. Worcester versus Georgia. So if you'd write that down, that would be great. Which dope came up and took this 3 reams of paper. All right.
Thank you. Probably didn't want to read that.
I want you to read these to me, if you would. Just go down that line, S-L-M-M like that, okay, so just a second. Okay, go ahead. Okay. 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 Okay.
The Great Depression makes sense. Not the Depression.
You said all the depression.
I said the Great Depression. You said
All the depression.
Okay, now we're gonna.
there was no other depression.
We
just talked about
it.
Same thing. Go ahead.
Is the
I
economic
did the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Oh, that's actually
The
not.
Dust Bowl
Okay.
is
No,
what
it was
caused
during,
Okay.
yeah, like,
It was just-
and there's
Okay.
like, the Dust Bowl, that's like,
Okay.
it's like for the game, and it's number one,
Okay.
it's like something like that.
Okay. 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 Okay.
Running down the side of the
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Frank goals, like when he died.
Okay. 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 That's it, all right.
Good job.
All right, I'll get that to Mr. Frederick and we'll get these shirts ordered. So it looks like we need 11 smalls,